Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Marian Miner Cook Athenaeum. My name is Chris Agard, and I am one of your 3 AF Fellows for this year. At Stone Mountain in Georgia, 3 prominent figures of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, are carved into the mountain's side as a means to memorialize and celebrate them. Today is the most visited destination in the state. In the past year, the movement for Black Lives has reignited the conversation about what should be done with monuments that celebrate some pretty awful figures in history. It has also led to the removal of at least 30 monuments since late May. While a bit of time might pass before we see action taken to get rid of the carving on the side of a mountain, how should we reckon with monuments that are more easily removable? And why are protesters and activists so passionate about this issue? Our panelists tonight are here to discuss these questions and more concerning the controversial subject of racist and hateful monuments. Ana Lucia Araujo is a full professor of history at Howard University in Washington, D.C. She has authored 7 books, including Slavery in the Age of Memory, Engaging the Past, edited or co-edited 5 books, and has published dozens of articles in journals and chapters in edited books on topics related to the history and memory of slavery. In 2017, she joined the International Scientific Committee of the UNESCO Slave Route Project. Additionally, she is on the editorial boards of several publications, including the African Studies Review and the American Historical Review. Cynthia Culver Prescott, Associate Professor of History at the University of North Dakota, is a historian of gender in the American West and the author of Pioneer Mother Monuments, Constructing Cultural Memory. She is also building a companion website for this book, Pioneer Monuments in the American West, that features interactive maps and timelines and provides images and information about the 200 monuments included in her study. Daniela Blei is a writer and editor based in San Francisco. She's a frequent contributor to the Atlantic Monthly, the Smithsonian Magazine, and New York Magazine, among other magazines and newspapers. Blei holds a PhD in German history from Stanford University, and her work focuses on Nazi and communist movements in post-World War II Berlin. This panel will be moderated by Sarah Sarzinski and Tamara Vinit-Shelton, professors of history at Claremont McKenna College. Using the Q&A function, we will accept questions throughout the program to be posed towards the end of the event. Preference will go to students, so when you send in a question, please state your affiliation with the college, student, faculty, parent, alumni, friend. As always, I must remind you that audio and visual recording are strictly prohibited. Please join me in welcoming Professor Araujo, Professor Prescott, and Ms. Blei to the virtual Athenaeum.
All right, well, thank you so much, Chris. I believe that we decided as far as an order of presentation that Professor Araujo will go first. So Professor Araujo, we invite you to share your screen.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Tamara, for having me. And I will start this presentation with a question: what is a monument? Monuments are devices that men and women in different societies have been using then for centuries to pay homage then to a particular person or designate a past event, we would say. Historically, many monuments have been conceived as either a statue, a stone, or another structure, placed then on a grave, for example, of a deceased person. In many ways, monuments are related to death and to the dead, like memory that keeps then the past alive in the present. Monuments are intended to keep the dead alive in the present. Monuments that we see today were produced then in a particular moment of the past, but they are not the past, and they are also not history. They are related to memory. History and memory are forms of human discourse, either oral or written, about people, things, situations, and events that actually occurred or allegedly happened in the past. Then history and memory as two modalities of discourse that engage with the historical past have many elements in common, and they are shaped then by the people who produced them. Now, historical discourse is an imperfect account based then on primary sources, we can say, such as a written document, a visual image, an object, or an oral account, produced then in a specific moment of what is conventionally defined as past. As historians, of course, our goal is not only to establish facts, we examine, select, classify, organize, and interpret these facts in the light of the existing evidence. Then, at the end of the day, a normative history produced then by academic historians is an organized account that attempts to explain the past. But history, as it's written by historians, is also biased. Historians can manipulate the evidence, and it's not indeed uncommon that what we call normative history, the one produced by us academics, combines, abbreviates, and also exaggerates events. Then memory and history interact, but living experience is usually conceived as memory and not as history. Then the monuments, they are devices that can be better understood as objects related to three different modalities of memory: cultural memory, public memory, and official memory. Jan Assmann, then an author who studied cultural memory, emphasizes that cultural memory incorporates a certain materiality and manifests itself then through rites, commemorations, ceremonies, texts, and material traces like monuments and objects. Then cultural memory is materialized and ritualized, and very often scholars refer to it as material heritage, because it is connected then to what we can say as physical remains that are important then to a particular group and society. Now, public memory emerges from a different place than it is through the engagement that people, they entertain with the public sphere. Then in different historical periods, whether then through actual or imagined stories, societies and groups highlighted and selected elements of their past. And through these choices, social groups highlight then specific features that help them to gain social visibility and recognition, and therefore also help them to acquire political power. Then these bearers of public memory, they rely on the past to legitimize their claims, but they engage the past through words conveyed and actions carried out in the present to oppose those social actors, racialized as Black, for example, who denounce racism and white supremacy. Then what these groups do have very little to do with the past, but is rather associated with the present. Then although monuments are connected then to cultural memory, it is in the context of public memory that we saw the emergence of the battles regarding the removal of monuments honoring pro-slavery individuals. Individuals and groups racialized as Black and identifying as descendants of those who were enslaved and colonized are those who led the initiatives to remove the monuments. And over the last years, we saw individuals racialized as whites, either in Bristol, UK, or in Charlottesville, Virginia, defending the monuments representing slave merchants and men who supported slavery, like Colston or Robert E. Lee. Of course, the discourses of these groups draw from their connections then with given communities, let's say Black or white, descendants of slave owners, descendants of enslaved people. Then even though these associations become explicit under specific circumstances and contexts, they are not always explicit, but they become explicit at some point. Now, public memory can only exist through the voices and actions of living groups who assert their presence in the public space through relations of power. And who says power here in the context of societies where slavery existed also says race. Then each group in play fights to make its views of the past dominant in the public space. Very often, the group that wins the symbolic battle is successful in making these memories official. Bearers then of public memory are organized along racial lines. Now, this memory is acquired then an official status when legitimate political or authorities, such as international organizations, governments, and universities, for example, embrace and recognize these memories by assigning them a permanent status and favoring them with the monopoly of public instruments. This is to some extent then what happened with the Confederate monuments. In some places, these monuments, they were initiatives led independently by specific groups that of course never consulted Black citizens of their communities. And in several instances, these monuments were endorsed by municipalities, politicians, and other official institutions, and then they enter this zone of official memory. The same can be stated regarding then the process of removing these monuments. Community and academics, indeed, they have been making demands to contextualize the monuments for several years. In the United States, in England, in France, in many other places. Their demands remained ignored. And then, and I will share here with you, let's go here. Then in some cases, and I am not with the good one, here we go. Then in some cases, when social movements, they took the streets, ordinary social actors took down the monuments. In other cases, public authorities, they decided to rush and remove the monuments to prevent the community members to take their the matter then in their own hands. And then in other cases, public authorities refused to remove the monuments and the communities remain intervening to re-signify these devices. Now, to conclude, we can say that in a few places where monuments were taken down, public authorities put the monuments perhaps back to their pedestals. In other cases, they were discarded or restored. In some cases, there were promises indeed to display them in museums, in some of the examples that I showed to you, where they can be perhaps contextualized. Finally, in all these circumstances, there have been debates then on what, if anything, should replace these monuments. Thank you.
Thank you. I think next up will be Daniela Blei. Dr. Blei.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. So I'm going to cover the German context, and I'm not sure how familiar people are with this history. So what I'm going to do is we're going to look at a couple monuments in particular, but before we do that, I just kind of want to review some major points of the Nazi period so that we're all sort of on the same page. And I really want to, point out here that I think, and I think many others would agree with me, that Germany has become really something of a model that shows us the ways that monuments and all kinds of memorial projects can really help a society confront a shameful past in ways that are productive, culturally and politically. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so here we are. So just starting at the beginning, can everyone see this okay? Yeah. So starting at the beginning, so Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933. He was, of course, head of the Nazi Party, which he created himself in the 1920s. And as you probably know, its platform was racist, anti-Semitic, militaristic. The Nazis really worshipped war, and vehemently anti-democratic. And immediately, I mean, really with remarkable speed, the Nazis set about destroying Germany's democratic institutions, banning free speech, establishing one-party rule, and purging anyone it deemed a political or a racial enemy. Racial enemies mostly meaning Germany's Jews. Here we can see a public book burning. And so books by political and racial enemies were burned, any artworks, I mean, really any sort of creative work. And just a few weeks, the Nazis went from burning books to creating a network of concentration camps to lock up political enemies and so-called racial enemies. And I think it's important to say that this revolution that the Nazis envisioned wasn't just about Germany. It really was about remaking all of Europe into a Nazi empire. And the goal was to dominate the world, to eliminate each and every single Jew. And to this end, Germany invaded Poland in 1939, which I'm sure many of you know, and this set off World War II. And I just brought this map here. This is sort of Germany at the peak of its power in 1942, and you can basically see that almost the entire European continent was under German rule. I mean, really just with the exceptions of Spain and Switzerland. Nearly all of Europe's railroads were redirected to meet a singular goal, and that was loading as many Jews as possible. And I should say here, not just Jews, but also other so-called undesirables, like Sinti and Roma, or what are sometimes called gypsies, onto cattle cars. And here we see, this is Auschwitz. We sort of see this process happening here without food or water, and deporting them to camps that were essentially death factories. And the key word here really is factories. What made the Holocaust unique was its modern industrial capitalist nature. So gas chambers were constructed to kill as many people as possible, as efficiently and as cleanly as possible. And German companies bid on contracts to build these gas chambers. The Nazis really developed a process for maximum efficiency killing. And they referred to human beings as basically being processed. We sort of see the language of modern industry throughout the Holocaust. So packed trains from all over Europe were unloaded at death camps, like we see here at Auschwitz. Men were separated from women and children. The old, the infirm, and the young were sent to die immediately. Ovens were built to burn dead bodies and quickly clear out space for new arrivals. In the end, as we all know, Germany lost this war, and a society that was thoroughly Nazified for 12 years basically imploded. So for 12 years, all of German society, its schools, churches, newspapers, sports, movies, universities, everything was radically remade with the goal of creating a racial utopia and getting more living space, what was called Lebensraum, for the Aryan race. And here are two propaganda posters. On the left, it says, "This here is also our Lebensraum, our living space." And this is the African continent, so it really speaks to sort of the global ambitions of Nazism. And on the right, the sort of ideal of, you know, the Aryan family, fair-skinned, blonde hair, blue eyes, having many children. So of course, none of this would have been possible without massive collaboration by most Germans. And ordinary Germans, we now know, and there's a lot of work by historians here, were very aware of what was happening, albeit to varying extents. And this is a map that I think is just like, you know, pretty shocking. So these are major Nazi camps in 1944. So there are many camps that are not on this map, smaller satellite camps. but we can see how dense this map is. And of course, remember, because of the nature of the deportations, they were done on trains. You know, where are major train stations? They're in cities, they're in large towns. So much of this was happening in plain view. So of course, since 1945, German society has been in the process of coming to terms with this. And the first post-war generation was really silent. Many even said that they suffered at the hands of Hitler or lost loved ones because Poland or the Soviet Union started the war. And almost every German said that they knew nothing at all about the Holocaust. And really what changed this, it took a while, it was the 1968 generation, who you can see here. And of course, you know, the 60s were a decade of protest around the world. So while all kinds of things were happening in the United States, in Germany, young people really went to battle against their parents, against teachers, and political elites. Students took over universities, calling out professors who had been Nazi party members. Government officials with Nazi ties were publicly shamed. And some Germans, and there's really like remarkable stories here, I mean, completely cut off ties with their families in this process of denouncing German complicity. So it's really thanks to this moment, this generation of young people, that German society has come to terms with started this process of coming to terms with its history. And so much so that there's even a word that was coined to describe this process, a very long German word, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means mastering the past. Okay, so now I want to shift to look at two monuments and some of the issues that they raise. So the first monument or memorial is called Places of Remembrance. And it's the work of a pair of artists, and the story is really interesting. So in the middle of the night in June 1993, two artists, here they are, Frieda Schnock and Renate Stih, put up 80 signs all over a Berlin neighborhood. The neighborhood is called the Bavarian Quarter, and it's where many Jews once lived, including Albert Einstein and all kinds of luminaries. So it was once a very Jewish neighborhood and really a center of Berlin's intellectual life. And after the Nazis, there were no visible traces of that Jewish presence. The artists didn't get permission from the authorities, and they didn't tell anyone what they were doing, just a few friends who helped them put up signs like this one. So on one side of the sign that we can see here is a loaf of bread, and on the back is the text of a Nazi law that said that Jews could only buy groceries between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. And then there's the date that the Nazi law was promulgated. So in all, there are 80 of these signs featuring 80 different Nazi laws. And what they convey is that the Nazification of Germany was done in this formally legalistic way to create the appearance of the rule of law. And here are just a few more so you can get a sense of these. On the left, one that bans Jews from singing in choruses, and the one on the right prohibits Aryan and non-Aryan children from playing together. So the 80 signs went up all over this neighborhood in the middle of the night, some of them even on people's front lawns. This is right in front of an apartment building. And what happened? So local residents were woken up by the noise, and they called the police, thinking that an anti-Semitic graffiti attack was underway. And the police showed up, and while the artists tried to explain their intentions, they were arrested. In the end, everything was sorted out, and the city decided that the signs could remain despite protests from angry neighbors who did not want to be reminded of the Nazi past every time they stepped outside. And of course, some worried about their property values and what would happen to the neighborhood. Today, 17 years later, this project is a huge hit, and it actually just like 2 months ago launched an app so that visitors can follow the signs in several languages and get some historical context. So what's so interesting about this project, I think, is that it had absolutely nothing to do with the state. And for many years, it really wasn't the German state, but it was local artists and activists who were doing the work of commemorating the Nazi past. And grassroots efforts like this one have been so effective in Germany because when non-state actors contribute to a memory culture, it belongs not to official institutions like museums or government buildings, but to regular people and their everyday lives. So obviously the other thing here is that places of remembrance is not a traditional centralized monument. It doesn't let you show up, stand there, think, do your memory work, and then walk away when you're done. It's also interesting because it's told from the point of the view of the perpetrators, not the victims of Nazism. And the artist's intention was to make Germans very uncomfortable and to confront them with the ubiquity, the inescapability of the Nazi persecution of Germany's Jews. Okay, very quickly, looking at a different, very different kind of monument. This is the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, and it sits right in the center of Berlin, next to the Brandenburg Gate and just down the block from the German parliament, which we can see there with all the flags on the roof. So this opened to the public in 2005, but after 16 years of wrenching debate. And the story is really the opposite of the places of remembrance. It started with a German parliamentary committee that decided that a monument was needed in the heart of Berlin, the German capital, to symbolize the centrality of Nazism and the Holocaust for German national identity. So the parliamentary committee held a contest and there were hundreds of submissions from all over the world. A jury selected the winning design, which is exactly what you see here, more than 2,000 pillars of concrete by Peter Eisenman, a New York City-based and also Jewish architect. It's cemetery-like, it's solemn, but it's also non-representational, and it has generated and continues to generate remarkable controversy. And I think what we can learn here is that sometimes even more important than the monument itself is the debate surrounding it, which becomes a very important part of this memorialization process. As more and more people have weighed in on this monument in the middle of Berlin, and this very heated back and forth continues to go on, it shows us the ways in which memory is never monolithic, even if it's collective. So some groups have attacked it for being too vague, for being abstract, leaving the message open to interpretation. We look at this, we have no sense of the historical narrative, right? Others from the very beginning rejected the idea of having one giant monument, which they say divests Germans from the obligation to remember, that this is almost like a cemetery for the 20th century, where Germans could simply leave the past behind. And some theorists of monuments, like Pierre Nora, have argued that rather than preserving public memory, what a monument does is it lets its visitors off the hook. There's this dynamic of sort of, okay, I showed up, I visited, and now I'm done thinking about this. The memorial's title, its passive voice, has also raised questions. The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. Murdered by whom? Many have asked. Germans and Nazis aren't mentioned in the name. Then there's the kind of more recent issue of how the monument has been used by visitors. So despite the city's efforts to maintain the solemnity of this space, the monument has become something of a playground in the sense that people come with their selfie sticks, they jump all over the concrete blocks, they play, they eat. Some have even come to party. And I think this really speaks to whatever the intentions are, a monument takes on a life of its own, especially when it's right in the middle of the city in a public space and it's not protected or locked up in a museum or some sort of, designated memorial site. Despite all these problems, I think the monument is really successful in the sense that it continues to generate debate. James Young, who is probably the most important expert on Holocaust memory, has said it's better to have 1,000 years of Holocaust memorial competitions and exhibitions in Germany than one final monument that puts an end to this discussion. So the first is a kind of grassroots, almost renegade project that isn't concentrated in one spot, but spread out on corners, streets, and sidewalks. And this other monument is this enormous national, even international undertaking, which, it has to be said, has many haters. But I think it's important to ask, what would it mean for the German government to not publicly and visibly acknowledge what happened last time Berlin was the capital of a unified Germany? And the decision to make this monument is a deliberate act of remembrance. It's an official statement that memory must continue for generations. Many critics have said, you know, we don't like this, and it just shows how no single memorial can speak for everyone in Germany. And of course, that will always be true. And here's what I think is really exemplary about Germany, is that for many years, at all levels of society, from above and from below, it has encouraged such a wide variety of memorials. And it's really this variety and diversity of projects, both big and small, that reflects the full complexity of the Nazi past from the perspectives of the victims, of the perpetrators, and also of bystanders. So it should be said that the German government in all this plays an essential role, even in helping create places of remembrance, because it, from the beginning, has always provided generous funding for the arts and for creative projects that makes all kinds of memorials like places of remembrance possible. Arguably, I mean, I would argue that there is really nowhere else in the world where the state and its citizens have attempted to make their crimes, genocidal crimes, a central part of their own national identity. And I think it really behooves all of us living in the US to pay close attention. Of course, memorialization and endless debates are not substitutes for real action, but I think that the German case shows us that they can be critical to bringing about real and lasting change. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blei. I think, Dr. Prescott, you are our last but not least.
Let me stop sharing.
Okay, so I'm going to shift us back to an American context, and I want to look at a form of monument that is far less in the public eye than our Confederate monuments, but that have many similar characteristics, similar history, and I want to look at ways in which controversy over the memorialization of pioneers has changed over time. And why it was controversial in various time periods, and what that tells us about how our society is changing. Let's see if I can put my slides forward. Okay, so when I say pioneer monuments, I'm talking about public monuments erected to celebrate early white settlers, typically in the American West, although they exist all over the United States. And the earliest of these monuments were erected in the 1880s and 1890s. They got started in this process in Western cities at very much the same time that Southern communities were starting to put up monuments to Confederate soldiers. And they're put up for many of the same reasons. Ultimately, I argue, they were about celebrating white civilization, and by sort of logical conclusion then, celebrating white supremacy over other racialized groups. And the earliest of these monuments tended to visually represent a racial hierarchy, showing strong white men taking Western lands and Native peoples yielding to white settlers. As we see here, a Native guide has led these white men to their promised land, in this case in Iowa, and then yields the stage, right? Technologically, geographically, as settlers come in and claim those lands. Some of the most prominent monuments pioneer monuments from the early 20th century or the turn of the 20th century, were explicitly hierarchical. This one from San Francisco, dedicated in 1894, celebrates the arrival of specifically Anglo-American or white American civilization in California. And it tells stories from earliest European exploration of California through the Spanish missions, Mexican settlement in California after Mexico gained its independence from Spain, and then US increasing dominance, beginning with the gold rush in and early settlement in the 1840s and proceeding from there. At the top, we have Minerva, the goddess of war, reimagined as Eureka, the spirit of California, accompanied by a grizzly bear. And then there are various scenes and famous individuals represented to show the process by which we went from Native occupation in California to specifically Anglo-American or English-speaking white American dominance in California. And this is seen, this racial hierarchy is depicted most explicitly in one of the 4 bronze statues, each of them heroic sized, around the base of the monument, which shows a Spanish missionary towering over a Native American man. The man in the background there is a Mexican vaquero, Mexican cowboy, who came to center stage after Mexico gained its independence from Spain. The city of Denver wanted to erect a similar monument in the first years of the 20th century. And the artist envisioned, again, a tower essentially of white supremacy. But the initial design proposal for this statue showed a Plains Indian warrior on horseback at the top, and then white settlers around the base. This caused outrage in the city of Denver in about 1907 because the white residents of Denver were convinced that whites were at the top of the racial hierarchy, just as the artist intended. But the artist had envisioned a progression from Indian savagery, as he termed it, at the top of the monument to white civilized society at the base. And this inverted what the general public expected to see, which was white civilization at the top. And so people threw a fit. It caused a big controversy in the local press. And ultimately the artist compromised by removing the Plains Indian warrior and replacing him with Kit Carson, who has a very complicated memory today, but who was best known at the time as an Indian fighter rather than as someone who was a friend of Native peoples. Similarly, San Francisco put up a monument to a pioneer mother. And let me pause and say, when women show up in pioneer monuments, it is almost always in the form of a generic pioneer woman, usually depicted as a mother with young children. We don't get individuals named, right? We just get a generic type. San Francisco decided to put up a monument to a pioneer mother, hired a prominent artist to sculpt this monument. But the proposed design for this monument also caused controversy because the artist depicted her in a way he associated with Western culture, which was dressing her in a buckskin dress and moccasins, evoking Native American dress. So this is a pioneer mother who was playing Indian, as scholars talk about it today, dressed as a Native person to suggest that she's one with the Wild West. But for white San Franciscans, this was not acceptable because to dress a white woman in Indian garb, as they thought about it, in Native dress, suggested a degree of racial mixing that they were uncomfortable with and called into question her racial superiority. And so people insisted that the artist change her clothing in order to make her look like a civilized white woman. Interestingly, they didn't have a problem with her children being nude, something that a generation later people probably would have thrown a fit about as well. So this statue, back for just a second, was erected in 1915. By the 1920s, Americans had settled on a very similar iconography for pioneer women. Certainly no buckskin to be seen. They wear long prairie gowns and wide-brimmed sunbonnets, typically accompanied by young children and either a baby or a Bible in her arms. Sometimes also armed with a rifle, only to be used in self-defense, never in an aggressive format. And this kind of imagery really dominated across the country in the 1920s, and many of these were prominent enough monuments that they might be familiar to many of you. You've probably seen something like this. After World War II, pioneer commemoration shifted away from these solo pioneer women towards a nuclear family. promoting imagery of early white settlers as representing the American family at a time when the nuclear family was seen as being a bulwark against communism and anything contrary to American cultural values. Later in the 20th century, pioneer couples, pioneer families were erected in statuary to represent settler persistence in a difficult landscape. No longer do we need to depict them dominating Native peoples. Instead, their battle is with wild Western lands, and their ability to persist, as the title of this monument shows, they came to stay, right? Without mentioning Native people at all, depicting them in any way, except that what this is really does is celebrates Native removal and erasure from the landscape. So even though they're not talking about race at all explicitly, there is still implicit in this a sense that white civilization, which we're now casting more in terms of good American family values, is replacing Native culture and dominating the landscape of the lands they've taken from Native peoples. Now, scholars started to focus on the American West, began to question the 100 years of focus on white pioneer progression and this progression of white civilization in scholarship beginning in the 1970s and really the 1980s and early 1990s, at a time when Native activism was also on the rise. And so as Native people began to protest, particularly as they approached the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus landing in the New World, Native people and scholars started to push back against narratives that cast Christopher Columbus as a great explorer and creator of America, and instead start to recognize him as a colonizer who brutalized Native people. Similarly, pioneer monuments start to come into question, particularly the very explicit racial hierarchy depicted in San Francisco's Pioneer Monument. And in response to public controversy in the early 1990s, San Francisco agreed to put up an interpretive plaque, which you can see just barely in the image on your right there, trying to explain the more problematic history that was represented in this monument. The city of San Francisco then landscaped around the monument, making it nearly impossible to see that sign, and very few people ever really engaged with it. Fast forward to the last 5 years as the Black Lives Matter movement and anti-colonization, anti-colonial monument movements have spread across the globe. There's once more been a resurgence in people activists questioning these pioneer monuments. And that resurgence of interest in San Francisco in particular led to the city of San Francisco deciding to remove just that early days statue portion of the larger monument. So on the right, you can see the empty pedestal that was left in September of 2018 when they removed this portion of the monument. So far, the intention is to leave the pedestal empty, and they've started to offer more public events that use that empty space to make political points. So for example, they've had photo shoots of Native people in their traditional dress, ceremonial dress, standing on the monument, representing that Native people have not disappeared, that they are a living people and still active. This year, we have also seen monuments, people questioning pioneer monuments that are less explicitly depicting racial hierarchy, really for the first time. What got the most public attention was the Pioneer and Pioneer Mother on the University of Oregon campus, which there had been several years of activism, historical scholarship demonstrating that while the image is not immediately racialized, that the context in which they were erected, the intention of the artist and the donor was to celebrate white supremacy. The university considered and chose not to remove the monuments over the past year or so, and protesters responded by tearing them down and placing the pioneer at the steps of the administration building to demonstrate their disgust with the university's refusal to really engage with this further. And this pioneer family, briefly in Portland, Oregon, was controversial again in the 1990s, largely because of its title, The Promised Land. The notion that God had given the traditional lands of many tribal peoples, of native peoples, to whites for the purpose of them claiming and transforming that landscape, was controversial in the 1990s. But the city ultimately did erect the monument, making a few sort of attempts to look more inclusive, but the monument stayed. That has now been one of the centers of the Black Lives Matter protests that have been ongoing all summer in Portland. And there have been protesters who have attempted to damage, but so far have not managed to remove this monument as well. So protests in the early 20th century, when these monuments were controversial, it was precisely because they were not racist enough. It's taken us 100 years now to begin to recognize that these monuments truly are racist, and for people to start challenging that basis, that understanding of Western history, to want to make it more inclusive rather than explicitly depicting white racial hierarchy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prescott. I'm conscious of the time, so I really just want to ask one question to the panel, just kind of by way of bringing together these very different geographies. To me, they have a lot of thematic similarities and really create an interesting set of questions for us in our time. So I just want to pose one question and have all of you give your thoughts on it. Maybe I'll call on you again in order of presentation. But it strikes me that when each of you are presenting in your different areas and these different themes, that one common thread is this challenge of making a static space dynamic. That is to say, we have these spaces where memory has been sort of, or a kind of version of memory has been represented, but that in fact through interpretation and reinterpretation, through different uses, through the projection of images or graffiti, or playing and partying, right? That these spaces come to take on new meanings. And so as we're looking forward to the future, and as major foundations like the Mellon Foundation are investing $250 million in rethinking monuments, what advice would you give? I mean, how can you think about sort of making these spaces dynamic, making them tell interesting and complex stories from your experience? Like, what are some pathways forward as we think about reimagining these spaces? And I'll just ask Dr. Araujo to go first.
Okay, I don't want to be pessimistic. I was very cautious when I saw the announcement by Mellon, because as we see, this is not the way that these monuments were created. And I am skeptical about the idea that a private foundation will sort of how can I say, manage these initiatives, even if I am aware that they are talking about funding specific artists and groups who are organized. These decisions, in my opinion, should be decisions of the communities, if they want to have a monument, if perhaps they do not want have new monuments. And I am concerned about this idea that a private foundation will in some ways take the place of the state to create some kind of official memory. Of course, this can work for a certain period of time, but new generations will come and will also contest what specific artists are doing in the context of this of their project. Then I still don't know how it's going to work, if everybody will be able to apply to have their projects then approved and so on. But I would be very cautious. I think that is the communities are different, the challenges are different, and at the same time, as you are seeing, because this has been a debate and has been an issue with the work that I do in terms of slavery, there are a lot of similarities in all the monuments that we are seeing in either regarding the Holocaust or slavery or colonization. Then how can we solve this dilemma within the national borders of a country like the United States and through a foundation that is projecting a sort of project that is pretty much national? Then this is my my view of this proposal that by now is very an initial proposal.
Thank you, Dr. Araujo. Dr. Blei, what do you think?
I mean, I think here the German model, again, is really instructive. I mean, I think something that, you know, no matter where the money has come from, Germany has embraced for at least 10 years now, the idea of sort of the juried competition, right? And sort of trying to make these juries, these committees that make decisions as diverse as possible in terms of, you know, experts in many fields, but then also locals, people from the community. And this process of, you know, receiving submissions and, you know, putting them in the media and, you know, really welcoming the public to weigh in. I mean, again, that becomes an important part of the process of building the memorial. And, you know, of course, you know, not everyone's going to be happy with the final decision. But I think that process and sort of making it as visible and transparent as possible, there's a lot to be gained in that process. It's not just about the end result, right? The memorial or the monument that gets constructed. It's about all that discourse and fighting and back and forth around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Prescott, what do you think?
I think that the German example that we heard about a few minutes ago, that's spread throughout the community, is really an important model to think about. That the notion that we can create one thing that's going to solve all of these problems is naive, right? And so I absolutely agree. It needs to be community. There need to be community stakeholders engaged in this. It can't be just a top-down process. But I also think we need to think in terms of plural monuments or teaching moments, rather than thinking that one statue, one creation of any kind is going to encapsulate all of the messages right now, let alone a generation or two generations down the road. That the plurality of voices, I think, is really important. And I think here, for example, of the Wall Street Bull, and the way that the creation of the artist who placed a young girl standing up, arms crossed, standing up to the Wall Street Bull, completely transformed the way that people around the world saw that sculpture, right? That we can put different things in conversation with one another and then create more complex meanings than the traditional sort of celebratory heroic statue would ever be able to accomplish.
Great, thank you. I think at this time, we'll shift into the audience Q&A portion. So I think I'm going to cede the floor to our AF fellows, who I'm hoping will pop. There they are. There's one.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for all of the information that you were able to share with us tonight. We don't have a ton of time left, so we are just going to do 2 more questions. The one that I wanted to ask is actually directed towards Dr. Blei, who talked about the Holocaust and really even before the discussion of monuments gave a really modern interpretation of the Holocaust, emphasizing the industrial, the bureaucratic nature. I'm wondering how we can understand, both through our monuments and also just as in public conversation, a genocide that started with the Kristallnacht, which was just a spontaneous eruption of disorganized, violent destruction, and that was overseen by Adolf Hitler, who's kind of an ideological zealot. How can we understand that as being truly modern rather than kind of counter-modern in the way that it was seemingly dreamt up and initiated?
That's a big question. It's an important question. You could fill there. I mean, there are many books that sort of tackle this question of, to what extent are the Nazis a modern phenomenon? To what extent are they a sort of anti-modern phenomenon? I mean, I think when we look at the process of the Holocaust and how we got from Mein Kampf, a book where Hitler sort of imagined a world without Jews, to this, really what's so remarkable about Nazism and the Holocaust is the compressed period in which all this happened, right? We're talking about 12 years for the whole Nazi project. We're talking about 6 years for the Holocaust, not even, more like 5.5. So I think, scholars have looked at language and the language of industrial modernity and how the Nazis spoke that way, but we also look at the way that they thought about the process and really, they referred to the Holocaust with this euphemism, the final solution, right? Because it was something that they were troubleshooting for the beginning. They had this dream of annihilating every single one of Europe's 10 million Jews, and they had to figure out how to do it. And the way that they did it, the method, was a very, using all the tools of a modern society, modern propaganda, but then also modern industry trains. Again, the technology in the gas chambers, this was a new technology that German companies developed for this purpose, right? So I think it's hard to, I think also what's happening there is that there's so many narratives in European history, like for example, the Balkan Wars that happened in the 1990s when Yugoslavia dissolved, where there was all this talk about ancient hatreds, right? Oh, these people have always hated each other, and that's why all this killing is happening, right? And that can actually be quite misleading, right? Some of this stuff is not ancient. It's actually, we need to understand why it happens, when and where it does, right? There's a reason why it happened in the 1990s and not centuries earlier. So in the Balkan Wars case, and then with the Holocaust, right? I think it's, I think the challenge for so many people is like, I think people come to Germany, German culture, German history, German philosophy, how do you get from, 2 centuries of remarkable productivity, artistic and philosophical production to the Holocaust? And I think it's really in a lot of ways understanding those not as opposites, but as interrelated in important ways. Sort of many people have drawn a straight line from the Enlightenment to the Holocaust, right? So I don't know if that answers that big question, but but it's an important one.
So I have a question. Dr. Blei, you talk about kind of how Germany and its monuments can be used as, I guess, a template or an example for kind of like how other people or other nations rather reckon with like their pasts. And I think what's interesting about that, excuse me, is that in Germany, like the Nazi regime was kind of an anomaly in like its history in terms of kind of government administration. And I wonder how in, for example, the United States, like people can kind of identify certain kind of things that are commemorated in monuments as an anomaly and not as kind of like a continuation in that historical process or progress. And anybody could speak to that, but I was just wondering like how you can kind of apply certain things or certain lessons from Germany to like kind of specific parts of the United States.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that Germans have been taught that Nazism was not an anomaly. And there are people who draw a straight line from Martin Luther to Hitler, right? So the sort of like, when does this all begin is a big question. And some people look at, you know, the First World War, but some people look at the early modern period, at the Enlightenment, you know, so I think, and it's taken a while to get here, but the Nazis are not an anomaly. They're sort of the peak, maybe, of many things that were happening in German politics and society. Of course, you know, with monstrous results that no one could have really imagined. But I think it's important to understand these things not as, you know, some kind of freak occurrence that comes out of nowhere, but as in terms of continuities, really.
I think in the case of pioneer monuments, people erecting them in about 1900 were intentionally drawing those connections, drawing it back essentially to Christopher Columbus. They didn't necessarily name him, and it was maybe in San Francisco, it's Sir Francis Drake they're looking at, right? But they were intentionally building an argument that this is a process and we are the pinnacle of it. And I think that's an understanding that we've lost. We don't think of it that way, right? The frontier process we see as a process, but that's past tense. That happened in this discrete period of time. And so I think it's just been in the last 10, 20 years, 30 years, that people have begun to recognize that this is a larger process of colonialization, of colonialism, and that it's not just, oh, heroic Americans who went west. This is part of a larger process of white peoples coming to dominate other people and doing so intentionally.
Thank you. So before we close, do any of the, oh, excuse me, sorry.
I just wanted to ask Professor Araujo to also comment on that, especially related to her work with the transatlantic slave trade, and if she has some comments to add to that, this conversation of different ways of thinking about monuments, and if there are those sort of possibilities for different types of monuments, or if they all have their shortcomings.
I would say that they all have shortcomings, but I still believe that there will be always a plurality of monuments. And one element also that I would like to highlight is what then Michael Rothberg has been developing, this idea of multidirectional memory. Then in many ways, monuments and memorials commemorating the Atlantic slave trade, they have been borrowing elements from these memorials and the ways that the Holocaust is memorialized. And if you look at a sort of timeline of the creation of monuments in museums, I would say, and memorials commemorating the Holocaust, many of them, they emerged in the 1990s. If you take the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, if you take the example of this memorial in Berlin, and this is the same moment when monuments also are being discussed regarding the issue of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. The very UNESCO Slave Route Project emerged in 1992. It was launched in 1994, but it emerged as part of the commemoration of the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. Then all this is very connected, even if we are working in separate separate ways. And this is why I insist on the need of looking at all these problems as something that is a transnational problem. On the other hand, all this issue of the Confederacy, we know that even the racial, the doctrines that emerged in Germany then in the 1930s was in many ways borrowed from what was being done in the United States during Jim Crow. Then all this is connected, and this is why you should be paying attention to these debates on race and memorialization as not as separated by national borders.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you raised that. I think, you know, the other important context here, why the 1990s? In Germany, it's really the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening of archives and this sense of remaking a new German nation. That is, you know, without that, I'm not sure that the 1990s would have looked the way that they did. And I'm sure the end of the Cold War, you know, maybe it was felt more than anywhere in Germany, but I think that's an important turning point for the whole world that really resets a lot of discussions about the relationship between past and present.
Thank you for all those comments. So before we close, I'd just like does anybody have any closing remarks to make? All right, thank you. Well, on behalf of Claremont McKenna College and the Athenaeum, thank you all for joining us tonight. Special thanks to Professor Araujo, Professor Prescott, and Dr. Blei, and to all those who sent in questions. Don't forget to join us for our next virtual Ath event, which will be on Monday, October 12th at 5 p.m. Pacific. Professor Henri Cole, award-winning poet and professor of literature at Claremont McKenna College, will read from his newest collection of poems. Thank you and have a good evening.